If we're relying on a bias, then we're pushing in a particular direction and we're leaving things off the table versus something holistic where we're getting everything on the table. And then you obviously have the speed and the effort and the calories that you will burn to put everything on the table and make a diligent, informed, rational based decision.
Hello and welcome to The Strategy Behind with Adam Cox, Jutta Tobias Mortlock and myself, Matt Wilkinson. Today we're going to be uncovering the strategy behind overcoming biases. And the reason why we wanted to look at this is there seems to be an explosion of, shall we say, interest in specific topics where people will be looking on social media, they'll be looking at particular worldviews, and they're only listening to the opinions that match their own worldview, whether that be in politics, whether that be in science, whether that be in academic research of any way, shape, or form. It might even be down to whether or not you like specific soap opera characters or not. We seem to have these very, very fixed worldviews, and my challenge to the team today is to really help overcome those innate biases and really start to unpick how can we help overcome them, because obviously going through life blindly without challenging what we believe to be true can be a very dangerous thing, especially when the world around us is changing so rapidly. So I'm going to throw this one off to Jutta first of all, who's smiling at me greatly. Tell me, what do you think about biases and where they come from?
With a name like Tobias or Tobias, I think I had better have thought about this a little bit. So how about thinking about de-biasing our life, almost like decluttering our life? So maybe the first thing we need to acknowledge is that biases are gonna stay. They're here. They make our lives easier and they're functional. So we have biases because otherwise we'd go mad trying to process and analyze everything. So then if biases are real and normal, what can we do to minimize their impact? And maybe that then leads us to thinking about, like, how can we live with biases and how can we almost befriend them and work with them in a more constructive way. And so maybe we need to unpack really what is a bias and where does it come from? And so perhaps to start, I would say a bias is basically, it's a shortcut and it's a simplification of how I make my decision. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but we don't see all the facts, and that's why we are prone to being biased in our decisions. And maybe I'm going to push it on to the strategist here and say, what's so bad about making biased decisions for the long run? In the short run, it's definitely useful. In the long term, it's going to hurt us.
Okay, so that's a big one. Biases within decision-making groups, leaders, is a massive challenge when it is unknown. Mm-hmm. I think that's the first big kind of stop here, is the self-awareness of knowing that you even have a bias or not, and its influence and role into the decisions that are then being made. And there are no shortage of people in the world who possess these characteristics that are unaware of them. And so it's not necessarily, the relationship between short-term and long-term. There is something there that we'll get to and we'll definitely unpack, but I believe it's much more something in relation to awareness or lack therefore of. Because if I have a bias that says, I have an anchoring bias. So by an anchoring bias, I have a particular position. I have dropped an anchor there, and for me to move away from that position is challenging my identity. And I'm a leader, and I got the name on the business card, and I got this position because I worked up through the organization and because of who I am. For me to acknowledge that is for me to challenge my identity and who I am and how I think. And I'm surrounded by an infrastructure and a set of circumstances that who I am has got me here. So why would I then turn my back on this? And then I have a conflict. I need to be self-aware enough to know that I have that conflict and then work on reconciling it. That's a lot of hard work. And a lot of people just like, you know what, not my department, put it to the side. I'm known for being a hard ass. I'll make hard ass decisions and away I'll go. So there is a degree of consciousness there, but I think it's also, this is too hard to reconcile. So therefore I won't. And that is the biggest danger. So back to you, Jutta, in relation to being confronted with beliefs that are so closely linked to identity, what does it mean to confront them? Is it meant to be almost in some circumstances quite a traumatic experience, or is there a way that you can shortcut it?
Let's talk about emotions. I think about emotions when you talk about, confronting what's real. I think the thing that trips us up most about biased decisions is our emotional attachment to them. And I think that's where it links to the identity that I'm attached to, like who I am. And at a most basic level, the way we process information is we look for patterns and we check which emotional tag is associated with whatever is in front of us. So the pattern is, have I made a similar decision in the past, or does it look like my anchor, or is it related to something that I know, or is it something that's just elegant? So people also are biased because they see the rule of three, and when people give 3 reasons, it's elegant, it looks good, it sounds good. So we like to look for things that are familiar, and then we like, and we then get attached to stuff that is, well, related to what we like, related to who we are. And so if we're aware of that for starters, we can then do something about it.
Okay, because then you have the subsequent knock-on effect. So I'm glad we've kind of looked at the emotive side of the individual who has these biases, and then it's the subsequent knock-on effect and how that can affect the bias in other people. One of the things I encountered in my time in corporate, time and time again, is it is a bias to a degree. It's what I call loudest voice in the room. So we're all sitting in a boardroom and the CFO, he or she, says something that's incredibly compelling and or may even be wrong or whatever it happens to be, and you get the empty head nods like, yeah, because this person is, we all know that they are earmarked for the next chief executive role and no one's prepared to go up against them because it'll be the end of their career. So you have this conformity bias. That everyone just drops in line, be like, yeah, look, Adam's on his high horse again, but no one's going to confront it because it's the end of my next promotion. I'm trying to do things with my life, whatever it happens to be. I believe that biases are transferable, like a virus. Like I can sneeze on you and tag, you're it. And it takes a particular type of individual to be aware of that and resist it and or call it out. And obviously that's context dependent, but I mean, for the individual themselves, they need to agree to take it as opposed to just falling in line because it's the right thing to do. And again, it's this unconsciousness, I think, breeds unconscious behavior amongst others, and it permeates. And you do this over a couple of years, and this is how you end up with culture. It's because, how the hell did we get here? And everyone's just going to like, because it's the way it is, or this is what it is. So it's kind of, it's a baton that then can be passed around. And I think it's up to everyone to be conscious enough to go, you know what, just because someone hands me this baton doesn't mean I have to take it. And what does that actually mean for me and my identity, for my career, for revenue, for whatever it is I happen to be kind of working for? That can be incredibly challenging. So again, it's, overcoming biases in a group perspective is one thing. Overcoming biases in yourself, I think is a very complex, tightly knitted knot of strands that really need to be quite selective in relation to which ones you're going to pull.
Interesting. You allude that, but therefore that bias is almost the root of culture, within a company culture, because actually you're shortcutting decision making. You're
an element of it.
Essentially making stereotypes of decisions. So whether whether they're helpful, such as we worship at the altar of science and knowledge, or the cult of the leader, whatever it is, there's almost a stereotype that we then have a bias one way or another, and that then shapes the culture of the organization. I wonder how that then plays out online, because one of the start points for me in this is that we see an awful lot of social media biases out there right now. And I think that social media, you can see real splits between groups of people that have differing beliefs, different biases. And it was really interesting to me around Brexit and a whole range of other topics now, even with the coronavirus, where you've got specific beliefs about the way we should perceive an event, something happening. And you move that then into, do people agree with me or not? And then if they don't agree with me, am I going to bother engaging, or am I going to just stay somewhere safe? So there's almost, as what you said, in the room of, if you're sitting around a boardroom and there's actually a specific person that's saying, the CFO says something, so we all agree. Actually, do I go to the path of least resistance? So there almost feels like there's a directionality of following the herd, as it will, whether that's online or not. And so you follow the herd, but you also follow the direction of your own, the path of least resistance for your own beliefs. And so those biases reinforce beliefs, and vice versa.
They also reinforce assumptions, and flawed assumptions is the poison to strategy. So I believe something will happen and it doesn't.
Matt, I thought it was really interesting that you're both you, Adam, you're also linking bias to culture, or habit to culture. Is like, the purpose of culture is to make decisions almost automatic, right? So we all know how to behave, but we don't have to think about it anymore. Men open doors for women in this corporation. The leader speaks first, the leader speaks last. We don't even think about it. And I think what you've just said, Adam, almost what did you say? The assumption is the enemy of strategy. Like you're unquestioning. Say it again.
Assumption is the poison to strategy. It's like, and there's so much research that shows that flawed assumptions are the number one underpinning failure point why strategy doesn't get successfully executed. It's because I believed something that fundamentally must be true, and it hasn't turned out to be.
So it's unquestioned assumptions that are the enemy of strategy. So assumptions themselves could be okay, but not questioning them, right? And I think we're moving towards the solution already, because I've actually been thinking and writing and teaching about this quite a bit. And so whenever you talk about how do you improve the decision-making process, people tend to focus on the data that they have available, and people focus on themselves and having to make a good decision. But that in itself is it's really hard to say, I have this aspiration of getting the perfect data, or I need to find out as much as I can before I make the decision. Focusing on the decision-making process is much more helpful in improving the decision, the ultimate outcome of the decision. And the more we can get several people involved in decision-making, the more we always improve decisions, because it's awfully difficult for me to find the flaw in my argument. It's awfully difficult for me to become aware of the stuff that I'm not aware of. But it's so much easier for you to become aware of it when you look at me, when you listen to me. And so a really practical suggestion is to shift our focus away from thinking we need to know it all to, like, how many more people can we actually involve in the decision-making process? Because data suggests strongly that the more we run decisions by other people, the better the quality of the decision. And that means we have to go back to the identity question of me being the leader who has the final say, who might lose face in not having the decision-making power. Adam, you're smiling.
There's two things before Adam jumps in, because I'm sure there's a
Go ahead.
load going to come in. But doesn't that also imply that you need to make sure that you have, if you're bringing other people into the decision-making process, first up, as a leader, you can own the process and not necessarily the decision, which I think is an important distinction to make.
Brilliant.
Secondly,
I'm going to repeat that. Sorry, I'm going to, because I think this is super essential what you've just said, Matt. So the leader can own the process, but doesn't necessarily have to own the decision. That's a fantastic distinction, to get the leader to have authority and power, but not over the decision outcome. Sorry, that was your first point.
And I think
Love
the
it.
second one that I've absolutely seen is making sure that you have enough diversity of thinking as part of that decision-making process. So I know we're coming back to another topic that we've spoken about recently as well here, but making sure that we don't have three people that look and sound, that have been through the same education process, that have lived in the same culture as me at work for 10 years, you know, that doesn't breed diversity of thinking necessarily. It may do. You may have people that think differently depending on the culture, but making sure that you've got people that think differently, that have had different experiences, I think becomes really important. To otherwise you don't broaden the perspective enough.
Okay.
Adam's smiling. Over to you, sir.
I've just run into an iceberg. I'm just like, it's like there's 1,000 things happening now. I'm like, okay, so let's rationally pick this off. I'll go in somewhat a reverse chronological order. Matt, your point in relation to diversity, absolutely, diverse opinions are valuable when accepted. There is no shortage on earth, particularly in corporations, where diversity is a quota, it is tokenism, it's blatantly so. I've got, there's one particular friend at the moment who is going through a process, has just been put in the charge of a very big piece of work. She's of Asian descent, and it's a big diversity and inclusion initiative in a very large organization, a multinational. And her first question straight off the bat to the leadership when she got appointed this is like, am I the token Asian? Everyone was like, ah! Like, to a point, A, you can't ask that, and B, why would you think that? But it's actually the underrunning current of something that I think we're at a really interesting point in leadership history or trajectory, where diversity, I think, is, for progressive organizations, is now actually going to start getting a serious blip on the inclusion side of D&I. So that's part one. And to need that, which kind of goes back to another couple of points that were just raised, is in relation to trust. So Jutta, your point in relation to consensus decision making amongst larger groups of people, and more people involved in the decision making process will get a more accurate answer. That has been scientifically proven. I know there was the wisdom of crowds, and there was a professor, the jelly beans, and goes, how many jelly beans are in the thing, and the collective group of 80 people have a more accurate understanding of how many jelly beans are in a jar versus everyone going individually going, oh, there's this, there's that. Collectively, there's absolutely benefit in that. I read a research paper a good couple of years ago called The Stupidity of Crowds, which is basically the antithesis of this. And it came down to a herding instinct to go, it came down to herding instinct. It came down to recency bias. Suddenly all the biases lunged forward to be like, well, hey, Matt's a smart guy. If Matt thinks X, I'll think X too, because I like being smart. And it's that, again, it's that transfer of what I am getting, positive or negative, from a bias that I'm interacting with from someone else. So I treat collective decision making with immense caution. I'm not saying it doesn't work. There are circumstances when it does. The prior salesperson in me cringes because consensus decision making when you're trying to sell something is it's a lobotomy. But how do we then pick up a smart bunch of people? Like, okay, what's my question? My question is around trust.
Mm-hmm.
If we have lots of people, diverse group, or a genuine diverse group through a D&I kind of definition, how do we then trust, like the three of us, how do we equally trust each other and our opinions to take them on to then shape a decision? Final point. I remember a couple of years ago, I think I was walking through an airport and it was leading up to the 2016 election in the United States. And I think I was in Dallas or something. And I saw a fridge magnet, and I love fridge magnet wisdom. And this was one of the better ones. There was a meme a couple of years ago of like a cartoon 1940s guy holding a beer going cheers, and then it'd have cheers, and then it'd have a quote under it. And you could enter in whatever you want. And this little fridge magnet said, cheers to the people who are willing to change their position when presented with evidence that contradicted their beliefs.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh, that's good. What do you need for that to happen? If I'm presented with evidence that contradict my beliefs, I need trust.
Mm-hmm. And I think you need another big word that we have chewed through at another podcast near you called motivation. You need the motivation to even be interested in a high quality decision outcome, or you need to be humble, not even just trust and motivation, but you need to be humble enough to realize that you may not have the best position, or you may not have all the answer, you might not have all the wisdom yourself. And that's something that is a different issue. And I completely agree, we need to put it on the table. But perhaps in order to unpack that, we need to talk a little bit about what persuades people. You know, what persuades me to either say, I'm going to want to stick to my guns on this one, or I'm going to go with you guys on this decision. I get persuaded not just by the issue on the table, but I also get persuaded by the context. I get persuaded by the periphery. Who's involved? How do I like that person? What's my relationship with people? And so all of these things matter for the thing that you've just talked about, Adam, almost the motivation to engage in a decision-making process that is more transparent and that is more likely to get us a good outcome.
Yeah, and that then loops back to Matt's point in relation to leadership owning the process, not necessarily the decision. But and also and that looks great on paper, and there are definitely circumstances where it works, but there's also definitely circumstances where that should be avoided at all costs, because then you look at privileged information, perfect information, and it's the whole thing about kind of government and citizens voting for them. Why are you asking Joe on the street? Joe on the street doesn't have a clue. I do not have a clue about many of the decisions that are being made in the country. However, you're asking me, an uninformed citizen, to give it a swing, and I cringe at that. So, but that's just a personal perspective, but that's also a bias. I have a bias towards evidence and fact, but
what is evidence and fact? And
exactly, is it subjective?
Can I just throw in that men are more prone to overconfidence bias than women, and that's data that proves it. So, what is evidence? What are facts? Facts are relationships. Facts are the fact that I have been right 3 times before. That's a fact, but that doesn't have any bearing.
But that's a recency bias. That then feeds into a recency bias. And then again, if I make 3 good decisions, then I believe I can make good decisions. Therefore, I have a higher confidence of making good decisions again, even if I rely less on the evidence to make those decisions, and then I increase risk. So it's a seesaw in relation to how these things go. And I think many of the biases are a seesaw relationship, where if we're relying on a bias, then we're pushing in a particular direction and we're leaving things off the table, versus something holistic where we're getting everything on the table. And then you obviously have the speed and the effort and the calories that you will burn to put everything on the table and make a diligent, informed, rational based decision. And, as the world moves faster and we rely on machines to do more things and whatever it happens to be, it's, I think the art of good critical thinking is starting to kind of fade away a little bit because...
I don't believe that. I don't believe that it's fading away.
Okay.
No, I think it's completely to do with motivation and humility, and then how long-term oriented am I in, and how committed or motivated am I in finding the right answer. And I don't think there's a fashion element to this at all. This 2000 years ago with Nero in Rome, you could have analyzed, how committed, how motivated was Nero to run Rome down, or to be in the long-term interest of the city of Rome. But I think the thing that's really important here is, if I cannot persuade you guys that humility or interest in a fact-based strategic decision is the right thing, how about shifting, trying to look at this decision as almost an exercise in uncovering our own biases. So approaching it like a detective, looking for the flaw in my argument. Could that be motivating? Could that be interesting? So I could, rather than treating the decision-making process like me being a lawyer or an attorney, kind of defending my position and then amassing evidence in support of my position, could I see the process as I'm Sherlock Holmes here. I am going to catch myself out, but probably it's more effective to catch Adam and Matt out, and then to get rewarded by Adam and Matt for catching their flaws, because in return, Adam and Matt are catching my flaws, which I don't see. They are aware of my blind spots that it would take ages for me to see my own blind spots. And then it becomes a game, and it becomes more motivating maybe to realize that I'm actually being persuaded by an elegant argument by somebody who I admire and who I secretly want to be like.
Yeah, and that's where you have dare I say, it's almost having pride in the outcome. So when you talk about process,
yes,
it's okay. So you need trust in the circumstance that, if Jutta finds a bias in myself and uncovers it, it's in service of something greater. And then when you reach an output, it's something we can all stand around and be like, yep, this is a collective good set of thinking. But to kind of backtrack just for 1 second, I agree with you in relation to kind of, it isn't necessarily, the thinking, the diligent thinking not being in fashion comment that I made. Let me kind of unpack that for a moment, because what drives that is short-termism. And I've done a lot of work on this topic in the last couple of years in relation to how to overcome a culture of short-termism and what drives a culture of short-termism and how short-termism is valued in markets, in society, in the food that I order for dinner. It's just there is a higher weighting on from a time a decision is made to a benefit is reached. Not many people are willing to put in the hard yards to change their life over a 7-year period. It's just chocolate. And it's you. And this one I'm going to throw it to Max. And I can hear Matt all these stoicism things going on, and the commitment to the outcome. And it's at least in corporate thinking, good strategists, I think the number is starting to reduce, not through the dynamics of there being less of them, but through them getting less airtime. Because I sat in online boardroom 2 weeks ago where someone threw out a 7-year timeline for a truly fantastic, transformational, and the evidence stacks. They should do this. No one would touch it. They're like, nah, we're going to close out the quarter strong. Everyone rally around this. And so it's the abandonment of thinking, but it's the abandonment of what the thinking then leads to. That's the fashion cycle that I was kind of referring to.
And I wonder if that's being driven by, so we know that the short news cycle, right? 24-hour news, it's addictive. The oxytocin from hearing what's changed, we even get interested in hearing about someone talking about the event that's talking about the event. The cycle propagates this very short-term endorphin-based approach to consumption of news media. We move to you move to social media, for example, and all of a sudden the way we're shortcutting decision making is, rather than doing our due diligence, we're saying, hey, celebrity over here likes this, we're going to like this as well. I mean, I've been absolutely amazed by the number of celebrities endorsing all sorts of things. I mean, I know it's across the board, and how far this social influencer thing has gone, whether it's Ryan Reynolds talking about Aviator gin, which had hilarious adverts, but all of a sudden Ryan Reynolds is the Aviator gin guy, and The Rock is no longer just the Under Armour guy and the big TV star and WWE star. He now has this tequila. Hey, I don't even drink, and I know what these guys are promoting. And it's just incessant that nearly everybody that has a platform now is being owned by or bought by specific products. They need the money to support their lifestyles. The products need the platform. And all of a sudden we get tied up with these unconscious biases. And if I happen to like X person, X celebrity, whatever it is, isn't it easier for me to like the things that they like, rather than suffer the cognitive dissonance of moving away from that and going, actually, I like this guy, but I disagree with what he says. Jutta, you're waving your hand, and go for it.
I absolutely love what you're saying. Adam, are you okay for me to go? Because I think you have something to say as well, right? Matt, this is absolutely fascinating what you're saying. And I'm gagging to say that, so I'm going to propose here something, that we live in an era of heightened uncertainty. And that's just real. It's more uncertain than 5 or 10 years ago, right? And there's more stuff that we are afraid of, that we don't know how it's going to pan out. And so what does the human, like me as a human, what do I need when my environment is uncertain and I'm stressed because I don't know where to go? I look for relationships. So the only thing that we have advised before, when the environment is uncertain, that you can be certain about, is relationships. And that's a really good strategy as well, to kind of down-regulate my stress about an environment that's increasingly threatening, because I really don't know what the world will look like in 5 years' time. And so my theory that I'm proposing here to you, Matt, is these social influencer endorsements are almost, they're an incarnation of people looking for relationships, people looking for better quality relationship, because it's the only thing we've got as human beings to get through an environment that's uncertain, that's threatening. But what we should do is not seek like almost this fake relationship by buying the gin that Ryan Reynolds endorses. But what we should do is get to know each other and have certainty with each other, because we have good relationships, and that is so much more functional than shopping, the things that we do in the short term thing. So we should invest in relationships even more than before, because of the era of uncertainty, of heightened uncertainty that we live in. And I think that will help address what you're talking about, Adam. Go.
The focus on building relationships as something that is high valued and makes sense for where we are in history at the moment, at least in my mind, gets all the ticks. Like, absolutely, it breeds all the right things. However, there is also an opportunity for that to be manipulated.
Right.
Matt, the phenomena you've just been talking about is social proof, and social proof is absolutely a bias. Like there's a video that's been going around for about a year now of Kanye West being Kanye West, talking about precisely this thing. He's like, Lady Gaga writes good songs, great. She's the creative director for Polaroid. What the fuck does she know about cameras? And I'm like, yeah, great point. It's this kind of overreaching element of, I can't think of a better word, taking the piss of my position and my platform to push an agenda that is transparent enough for our good friend Mr. West to call it out and be like, hey, that's BS. However, it's when you look at building relationships, you also need to look at access to relationships. So, when I'm sitting on the toilet scrolling through Instagram, it's just like, yeah, creative director of Polaroid. Awesome. It means something to me in that moment. But its credibility in relation to my identity and how I think about buying a camera or whatever is this person going to influence me buying the gin or buying the camera or doing whatever? Most of the time not, but I think that is because you need a level of self-awareness to understand what is actually driving the relationship here. And it's I completely
a good enough relationship to call out that you're being unduly influenced by the periphery of the topic. And by periphery, I mean, who says it? How does he look when he says it? So as opposed to focusing on the core of what you're trying to judge here, what you're trying to evaluate, which is the qualification of somebody to be the creative head of Polaroid. That's the core, that question. But we're almost like, I just don't have the self-awareness to catch myself that I'm going down a rabbit hole.
But you also have the self-awareness to identify empathy. And an empathetic relationship, whether with someone that on a one-on-one basis or with someone that is more distant, and you have you only receive communication, like some of the celebrities that we're talking about here. I think being empathetic in, let's say, a social media context will do amazing things for a particular outcome. In this example, shaping behavior to meet to cater to a particular demand for economic output. Great. Whereas let's now bring it back to a conversation between the three of us here. Whereas being empathetic when you identify a bias in someone is probably an incredibly good like olive branch to extend, to be like, hey, Adam, I know you've made 3 great decisions recently. So, you might have a recency bias. You wouldn't say that, but you think it, it's all in the delivery. You've made really good decisions. Great. And you're really, really respected. And we know you can think, and that's great. However, this is a different set of circumstances. We need you to kind of abandon the prior experiences and look at this with a fresh set of eyes, because this is different. It's different here, here, and here. You go, oh, okay, cool. Because then you're kind of setting me up to overcome my own bias, because you're leading with empathy. So when we look at collective decision-making or bringing more people in to make better decisions, I think a way to build that trust is potentially to lead with something like being more empathetic.
I love it. Can I riff off that one? Because I love this idea, and I'd like to tune it up a little bit. So I really like that you said, we could maybe propose a little bit of empathy. And so where I'm going now is think, how do I train empathy? How do I teach somebody to be empathetic? And I teach somebody to be empathetic by taking the position of somebody else. So I say, in order to be empathetic, even with Adam's position, Jutta has to really think through, what does it feel like? What is the attitude that drives Adam's words and his actions? How does Adam feel when he says or does something? And how would I feel if I were in the shoes of Adam? And so then if I go through these 3 questions, my empathy for Adam increases. And perhaps when we're talking about decision-making and improving the decision-making process, we could think more about how do our decisions, and maybe the decision that we are about to take, impact the stakeholders that might be surrounded by the decision, and then put ourselves through those 3 questions to almost become empathetically aware of the potential impact of our actions. And I think that might be almost the safer version of what you've just proposed, because it almost trains the muscle of empathy in an indirect and in a neutral way, rather than saying, hey, Matt, I actually think you're going wrong here because I'm seeing something that you don't see. It's almost easier for all three of us to go through this exercise together without almost, pointing fingers at each other's empathetic flaws. What do you think?
Well, if I look at, I think it works in a trusted group for a start. So I think with a trusted group, it works. What I think where I have real challenges, even understanding what is going to work, is when you start looking at, shall we say, social media and the sheer polarization of bias around particular political opinions, for example. Whatever that be, whether that be racism or left versus right, whatever argument you want to talk about, there are some really extreme opinions. And I've ended up talking to a few people where purposefully going out of my comfort zone within my own group where there's a specific set of biases, maybe I'd like to think they're right, but who knows, they're biases, right? So they're comfortable for me. And you start talking to other people. If you go out and highlight all the flaws, you're as likely to get called a troll and to be just ignored as you are to be listened to. But I think if you can go in there and agree with certain amounts of things, ask to be can you explain this? I don't understand why this, and start almost questioning and getting people to come up with, give you answers that don't come back into the because it's great or whatever kind of thing comes into. I think you could start moving a conversation away from a fixed position to something where you can open things up. I don't know if that sort of fits with the empathy approach, because you're still having to think kindly about the person, not wanting them to lose face.
The thing that comes to mind about this, Matt, is timing really matters, and checking with the motivation of the other person really matters as well. So if it's not the right time, if people are too busy, or if they have to make a decision at that point, or it really feels right for them to not open up the box again, you can talk yourself green, and they won't hear you. And if you can sense that somebody is not open-minded, that's the second thing. You're also wasting your time even trying to point out anything at them. So if people are not open for whatever reason, you then have to basically, you can't engage with somebody and try to point out the flaw in their argument if they're not interested, and if it's not, the timing is not right. And I think timing is a really important discussion about decision making and improving decision making, because sometimes you have to make a decision, even if it in the long run turns out to be a flawed decision, because you cannot keep on moving on. And so maybe we also have to have a bit of compassion for people who make the wrong decisions or who are biased, because in the moment it is the right thing to do. But what do you do then? What do you do then to unpick it? And how do you help people unpick flawed decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think also I completely agree with the timing comment. And I also think there's a piece in relation to the delivery. And if I think about, when you come up against a bias, what is the right way to surface it in a non-confrontational way? I think it's almost to inverse the bias that you're encountering. For example, we're having a conversation and I hear a normalcy bias where you are meaning around the way that things always are, and you're not considering any of the edge cases that could potentially derail a decision that you're about to take. So the way that you could deliver a challenge or a way to kind of press on that is almost through an alternative hypothesis and then invert it. So I could say, okay, so therefore, to make sure this works, you've done all your scenario planning around the highest probable set of scenarios that might actually derail this, right? Oh, okay. So, I'm taking a slight step, but I'm doing so in a positive reinforcement that helps them reach their outcome, which is, successfully making the right decision that leads to a particular goal or objective. And it's this alternative hypothesis inversion of what you are hearing that can be delivered in service of the right decision and in service of the person who's making the right decision, but just slowly push the walls of their bias out a little bit to try to kind of go, yeah, okay. Oh, I haven't actually thought about scenario planning. Okay, well, scenario planning is the benefit. And suddenly you're talking about moving away from not the normalcy position of going, well, this is what I believe is going to happen, and therefore I'm going to make my decision around what I believe always happens. And it's things like that. I think there's ways that you can uncover these things in the right time through the right delivery that can actually start helping you overcome these things. So you still are delivering it with a teaspoon of empathy, and you're putting themselves in their position, but you're also very diligently minded, and your ear is incredibly accurately attuned to pick up on the biases when you encounter them. Like Kanye West, and he's gone, yeah, this is about money. And fine, it might be about cameras, I don't know. But it's if we're making a decision, we have to know, okay, so if we're hearing a bias, what is it about? Like, what is that bias then tied to? If the bias is tied to a successful outcome, but I'm not considering other options, well, then you go, okay, well, to make sure you reach that option, you should consider other outcomes, because then you have a higher probability of reaching your outcome. It's just flipping it a little bit, but still, again, it's keeping your eyes on their prize. I think it is. And if you can keep your eyes on their prize, that is one way you can get actually underneath the bias and start to move the walls out from the inside.
I love that too, because I'm thinking, as you're speaking here, Adam, that mood really influences how what you say to me lands. And so what I think you've just said here is a bit about almost making it a bit more lighthearted and separating the decision from the person, and almost playing with it a little bit. So almost encouraging us to kind of experiment, see it as an experiment, see it as almost, I know it's maybe a bit far-fetched to call it like a game, but the more lighthearted and the more we are, and the more we consider alternative futures, alternative scenarios, the more we're going to catch the stuff that we wouldn't catch if we were too attached, and if we're too earnestly or seriously kind of almost identified with a certain position. And you both, of course, know about Gary Klein's pre-mortem, or, like imagining you're going back to the future. So fantastically effective technique to improve decision-making is to imagine ourselves in the future and imagining it has all gone terribly wrong. And then backtracking from there to say, so we're 6 months in the future. We're 6 months older, 6 months more crumply. We have a lot less money. Why is that? Maybe this is too expensive. Relationships have gone down. Maybe it's because we've been not careful enough about how we communicated this decision. So we can backtrack. And this, I think, is the really practical thing about this. How can we get to see as many different realities, as many different versions of reality before we make the decision? Take the perspective of the other, show some empathy for different positions, transport ourselves into the future and imagine and trying out what it looks and feels like if we have already made the decision before we make it. So we see these different realities before we leap, really. What do you guys think?
Yeah. Well, you've just brought up one of my favorite topics, of course, because Gary Klein's pre-mortem comes from the ancient Stoicism as well. So, and it's something I did introduce in a big project when I was back in corporate. It was really interesting. We had a phenomenal 2 hours doing a really in-depth deep dive into how is this going to fail. And what was really interesting was that some of the uncomfortable truths that we imagined, that we then when presented back that weren't listened to, that we're told that's not going to happen because of X and Y, were actually completely the reasons why the project didn't go as planned. Mm-hmm. So what's really interesting, I think, there is that you've got a bias that X isn't going to happen. This couldn't happen. So you're, again, coming back to both your points, and you sort of, this is an edge case, but it's an uncomfortable truth. It's against our, it gives us cognitive dissonance, and therefore we're going to ignore that piece. And I think that's where even doing a project pre-mortem, you end up still coming into those unconscious biases that kind of are too tied in with people's identities.
So how do you then? Yeah. So then how do you, in the moment when you're doing something like a pre-mortem and you get that pushback, that will never happen? Like how do you then address that? Historically, I've always just called it out, but you have to have faith in the fact that you're not going to get a 2x4 across the back of the head after the meeting for doing it. And so that comes again back to that psychological safety element and trust.
It does.
And leadership to treat it like an exercise. So leadership to treat it almost like as a game to play. So it might never happen, but isn't it interesting? And isn't it intriguing to imagine this, even though it will never happen? And we could kind of put a bit of a barb in there and say, yeah, it can never happen, just like a pandemic can never happen in 2020, right?
Yeah. I think there's two things there. One is the first is to go, okay, so actually to question, so why do you think that? How are we gonna make sure that doesn't happen? So I think it's actually straight away with the response that can never happen. I'm glad to hear that. Can you tell me how we're going to make sure that it doesn't? A meteor could come and hit the Earth tomorrow. Who knows? How are we going to make sure that doesn't happen, right? So we've got surveillance satellites out there, but have we actually built a planetary defense system against it? Because it's, let's face it, there's a virus, there's a global pandemic going on right now, but the chance of that wiping out the human race is much, much smaller than a meteor hitting the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're talking here is an overconfidence bias. Is that I can get up at the front of the room and say, this meteor is never going to hit the Earth. Why are we talking about this? This is a waste of my time. I'm the executive and I'm not paying for anyone else's wages as long as this meeting goes on. And I'll just put my foot down. And you've got to kind of find the intestinal fortitude to kind of go, okay, boss, listen, great, low probability, incredibly high risk. And that's where you need to start pulling out some, okay, well, here is the evidence as to why we should consider it. And the probability, if this does happen and we ignore it, increases our risk profile by X. Are you happy to absorb this risk? Because what you're then doing is you are calling out the bias and its relationship to the decision if you're wrong. And you get them to sign off on it. And you just go, yep, so you're happy that if this goes down, it's yours. And it comes back to this ownership dynamic. It comes back to accountability.
I know. Adam, I'm just thinking, if we're going down that route of, we're making people accountable for their decisions, and of course, especially if this is the big leader, right, who has the final say anyway, we're almost going down into this, like, it feels a bit like warfare. It feels a bit like, two parties fighting with swords. And that's
correct.
Just exactly not how we want to run these decision-making.
So 100% agree.
Somehow appeal to the better nature. How did Abraham Lincoln say this? Like, appeal to the better nature of their being, like the angels of their nature, I think Lincoln said. So how can we appeal to that overconfident leader that it's in his or her interest to explore possibilities that they think are crazy? But
it comes down to, sorry, I was just going to say, it comes down to, Walt Disney's, suspend disbelief and, abandon your position. But absolutely, the point I was making was one in 100% agree, is that, the combativeness, the combative approach, it's a forced outcome. You're like grinding over it, but you're not addressing it. But the point I was making was very much coming from when you get a position where the individual with the bias refuses to be abandoned. It's like, I'm not going to walk from my
Right.
overconfidence bias because I know I'm right, because, and particularly in the time constraints of which decisions must be made, you can go, okay, listen, boss, you want to cop this on the chin? Yep, let's go off and do this. But if this happens, your head it be. Or a much more, beneficial, favorable way forward is precisely what you're saying, Jutta. But yeah, Matt, sorry, you're going to say something.
I was going to say, I actually think that if you've got to the point where the combative approach is all that's left for you, then you've probably already lost and you've already missed the opportunity to take the softly approach. Where the reality is that if you're, at least the way I see it, if you're in a prison, and you may have walked into a losing scenario anyway, so let's not fake this. The winning and losing here is maybe a little bit subjective, but as I see it, if you've got to the point where you've got to fight, you've already missed the opportunity to do this gently and actually create a process and an environment where you can have those productive conversations where you're able to challenge bias. You've already lost it, at least for that, in that instance, and you have to start small and persistently chip away at being able to build checks and balances against biases into the process. But you're not going to do it the minute, if the big leader just steps out on stage and announces something, the chances of you being able to then change their opinion after the fact without significant information is huge.
I've seen that happen my fair share of times in my career, but I think you're bang on. It's creating a space where you have the opportunity to unpack beliefs.
And do you want to continue, Adam? Because I would love to go in here. So we want to create the space where it's possible to unpack beliefs and then deal in facts as opposed to in beliefs, attitudes, biases, etc.
Emotions.
And so that's right. And prejudgment, prejudice, right? So Rolf Dobelli, fantastic guy who wrote a beautiful book summarizing 100 biases. I think it's called The Art of Thinking Clearly. Wonderful book. At the end of the book, he gives people one piece of advice and he says, track your decisions and their consequence. So collect data. And if we are in this position where I don't believe you anymore, you don't believe me, I don't trust you for the 3 arguments that you bring, then we have to go down the route of saying, okay, now let's see, for the decisions in the last 6 months that we've made, what decision did we make? What has the consequence be? And can we quantify the evidence that, so we're now we're dealing in facts, especially if we could do this either retrospectively or if we don't have a functioning team, we do this for the next 3 months. We say, okay, we're going to go with this decision, and then we're going to track what will happen. So we get data-based decision-making. And that also reminds me of Dan Ariely that Matt, you've mentioned before as well, because Dan Ariely said, he's a fantastic behavioral scientist and decision-making scholar. And he said, it's terribly difficult for us to anticipate, what the world will be like in the future. But what we can do, so for example, if somebody asked me next February, will I go on a week-long holiday with you guys and your families? I go, yeah, sounds kind of nice. I don't think I'm very busy next February. Dan Ariely says, if you don't know what will happen in the future, look at what happened this past February in your life, or look at the February like 2 years ago, maybe pandemic February, a little bit different, right? But look at any data that's similar to the data that you're trying to make a decision on. And that is quite emotionless, isn't it? It's kind of, if you kind of contract it, you go, okay, so in a similar position a year ago, which way did we decide? And why, and what was the consequence? So can we use that as data to get us unstuck? Because we need to get unstuck, right?
Yeah, well, 100%. I remember years ago, I was advising an organization that did exactly that process, except it was a circumstance that doing it retroactively didn't help anyone because everyone would argue over what were the elements of the decision at the time and what did I mean and what did I not mean and blah, blah, blah. So they actually created a category of going, okay, so when the decision makers are meeting to make a decision, you would have basically a shadow cabinet or like a scribe who would sit behind and kind of go, okay, so Adam's made this decision. He's made it based on these things. Here are the biases or assumptions that underpin it. It goes on the file. You look at the performance of decision versus the forecast of decision, and then you get multiple decisions based on similar decision-making behaviors over time. So then someone can walk in 3 years later and go, are you aware that this organization has an excessive risk bias? And everyone's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, I can see that on low impact decisions, you are excessively risky. However, for big decisions, you are abnormally conservative. Your relationship with risk is rubbish because you're all over the shop, because you're adapting to the moment as opposed to being principled based on where you're trying to go. And sometimes that might be the right way and sometimes it might not be. But to your point, Jutta, they had data then, and what they would do is that when a new decision session came around, they'd spend 15 minutes going, the last 7 decisions have been this, and this. Here is your behavior with risk. You're all over the place. So where are we as an organization in relation to our risk appetite? Now we can begin the meeting. And it really snapped everyone into line to be like, so we got the historical repeating biases that was showing their heads, rearing their heads in decision making, quantified it in relation to what it actually meant, not to the decision, but the performance of the decision over time, and then feed back in as evidence to recalibrate the room in relation to making better decisions.
I like it.
Yeah, 100%. I like it a lot.
I also like what you've just said, and I want to pick up on it. It would be great to be more consciously aware of the fact that we can separate the decision and the performance or the outcome of the decision. If we almost, have an additional thing to focus on, not just the decision, but also how well is it going? How well is it doing? And so we're just opening up the lens of what we should pay attention to. That gives us more data, and that improves, I suppose, our choices really.
So
it's a, sorry, go on, Matt.
I'm going to say, so I'm really curious here, because some of the things that you've said, I think, building those frameworks in a corporate environment really, really makes sense. What I'm then curious about is, how do you then build a slimmed down version for yourself? So you don't always get the opportunity to go out to another group. You don't always get the opportunity, you're talking about sort of having big risk, big decisions versus small decisions. Very often when we go out and we're buying bread and toothpaste and stuff like that in the supermarket, and I'm trivializing the decision here, right? We rely on brands to the trusted brand to help us make a decision. So we only pick up a specific brand of bread. We only pick up specific brands of toothpaste, of milk, because of X experiences in the past. We do those a lot. We get better at making those decisions in some ways. We then move to bigger decisions, and we may ask other people for their opinions, say buying a car, buying a house, but actually we do those things very infrequently. So we don't have the practice of making those big decisions. And there's often not an awful lot of in between, so you maybe go to the supermarket, you don't make a huge it's not a huge expenditure. It's one you do every few days, 7 days, 14, whatever, to something you do maybe every 5-10 years. There's not an awful lot in between that. How do you build out a personal process for accepting your risk tolerance when there can be huge disparities over the impact and the hazard of those?
I think the first place I would start is that should there be different decision-making behaviors based on the decision itself? Like who's making, where is the constant? Is the constant in the individual making the decision because you're making your decisions on a particular set of beliefs, biases, assumptions, and who you are in the world and the relationship to it? Or are you being context dependent, going, oh, this is a bigger decision, we need to be more cautious? And you then have to adapt. You have to be adaptive to the variability and the complexity and the uncertainty of each decision as it comes to you, versus, and this is what I'm interested in hearing from Jutta, versus the autopilot. So when I go into the shop and I know what bread I'm buying, it's not even conscious. It's just it's a decision that my history has made for me to therefore predict my future.
It might also be wrong though, right? Just because past
I don't eat
performance,
bread.
right?
I'm gluten intolerant.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're lucky in that on that decision. You don't have to make
But
it.
you do
Right?
drink
But it
milk,
could be.
and so you may choose. You
Born on a
may
dairy
choose a
farm.
specific. You may choose specific brands of milk, or you may not care.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I was just thinking as you were speaking, Adam, that these low probability events, but it still is, even that is a heuristic, it's a bias to think that for low probability events, we are necessarily worse at making those decisions, like buying a house, Matt, buying a car. I think it really depends on our awareness of like, how confident do I feel? How good a fit is it? Is it, does the data match my expectation of how much detail I'm supposed to get? And then even if it's, something that I either do automatically, habitually, or I do very rarely, I should really take every decision at face value, excuse me, and maybe uncover as much influencing factors as I possibly can, pull them into into consciousness from automaticity, and then I think my rule of thumb is I will improve my decision. What do you think?
I like where you're going with that. It's particularly the point around pulling it up from the unconscious, and this is kind of a commitment to robust thinking, and it's a commitment to self-awareness, and it's a commitment to being mindful.
And to not proud, like humility. I think we're coming back to the beginning of, like, to be really interested and curious. And that's, of course, a key feature of mindfulness. But you need to have the safety in yourself and safety in the relationship to be able to be curious as opposed to defensive, because that's the opposite of curiosity, right?
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the safety thing, because I think this is a nice point to kind of start bringing into land, because architecting safety, I think, and this theme has come up a number of times. It's safety, it's trust, it's empathy, it's relationship. It's all these kind of fundamentals of kind of, the human condition and interaction that are basically driving how to actually overcome biases. Is there some ways to architect safety? Like, how do you actually bring that into a decision-making environment to be like, okay, this is how we're going to do it?
Oh,
process.
I have something for that. I've just recently read about Jane Dutton. Jane Dutton is the mother of positive organizational scholarship at the University of Michigan. She's glorious. And she found, and I read about it recently, that she asked the question about, how many high quality relationships do you need to feel safe in an organization? And how many do you think you need?
3?
Matt?
I would have said 2 or 3.
And it's a trick question. So she says 1, and that's what her data shows. So in any organization, you only need 1 high quality, safe relationship for you and for that other person to have dramatically better well-being than people who don't have high quality relationships, or people even who have 2 or 3 high quality. It just doesn't go up linearly, right? So it's of course great to have 2 or 3, but you only really need 1 good friend that you trust in an organization. And she has this really fabulous exercise that she gives all her students. And I went to the academy, and so she basically does this a lot. So she says, in 1 minute, 2 people take turns to establish a high quality relationship with each other. You have 1 minute, go. And then people talk and ask questions. And what types of questions do they ask? They ask questions about what's important to people, what maybe they are worried about, so those are the types of things that establish high quality relationships quickly. And then the other thing she does with that exercise is she gives them only 2 minutes for this task. And then she gives them another 2 minutes where they take turns to feed back to each other what worked in establishing a high quality relationship. And I say this because this is cool for 2 things. Not only is it actually quicker to establish trust and safety than we all thought, but the other thing that is really groundbreaking or really cool about her data is that when people get feedback on how they're doing in working on relationships, their capacity to build good relationships goes up. Because normally, even though we like each other and we do a lot of talking, you don't give me all that much feedback about how I have done to make you feel good, right? So this explicit focus on the topic of safety, the topic of trust, helps drive and improve trust. Am I making myself clear?
Crystal, I think it's brilliant. And I particularly like the fact, and maybe this is kind of the intersection. My thinking earlier was creating a space to unpack beliefs, and this is kind of a interpersonal version of that.
Right.
I like that a lot. I like that a lot.
So what are our takeaways here? We did say that we said it could become, we want to fight decision processes getting ugly and defensive and prideful. But we have to be aware that it could go that way. And then Matt, you were saying that you almost want to make people accountable, you want to show them the consequences of their actions, and you have to probably make decisions, and you have to allow people to make decisions. And we also said that the ideal world is a world of pluralism, and it's a world of us being interested in the process and interested in each other's opinions. And then we talked about how do we get to that? And we just talked about relationships and safe relationships and trusting relationships being really good for that. What else do we need to remember about this?
So one of the things that Adam brought up that I thought was great was really it's about tracking the decisions. Tracking, and to build on that slightly, so tracking the decisions, the outcomes and the consequences, but also some of the assumptions, and not just that we decided X, but also what was it that caused the decision to have to go in that direction. And so can we then essentially take decision making from being something that we just do to something that we study? And I think if we're able to take that learning approach to decision making, we can start sitting with the decisions we've made previously and start moving forward in a more curious mindset, rather than a more self-identifying mindset, which I think is where we end up having problems.
Fixed mindsets versus growth mindsets. Couldn't we see decisions as an opportunity to grow and to learn?
Absolutely.
What organizations would that be, wouldn't it? Like, could we we help create organizations where decisions are a learning and a growth opportunity?
Yeah. And I think to that point, kind of the two big things that I'm taking away from this is, Matt, to the point you almost just made in relation to process. It's, there's no shortage of decision-making processes out there and ways to strip it, but divorce the decision-making process and park it to create a space to explore, to learn, to grow both yourself and the collective. So you're going into it leaving the attitude at the door and going, okay, so this is an exploratory, it's like creating a space to play. And the second part in relation to process ownership or process decoupling is your point you made a couple of moments ago, Jutta, in relation to that safety exercise of the 1 minute each, and actually creating the space and creating a space to unpack the individual beliefs in service of safety and connection. Then there is a higher likelihood to be able to call particular biases when they arise, knowing perfectly well you're not addressing the individual, you're addressing the phenomena, because there is already some form of relationship that can take that, that can take that feedback, as opposed to, well, who the hell are you? So I think that's incredibly powerful.
And I'm just going to repeat what I've just learned as you guys were reflecting. Matt, I think if I understand you correctly, you're saying we should have a decision-making process, and then we should have a process to learn from the decision. So it's almost a meta process, it's a meta process about decision-making, which we could also make decisions on it. But so that is really a way of organizing mindfully, right? Organizing with awareness and over-determining and making absolutely extra sure that when we make really important decisions, we're going to make the right ones, because we're investing time in even thinking about how we make decisions when it doesn't even matter, when we don't have a decision to make. I think that's fabulous.
Yeah,
Great.
Absolutely. I like it. The strategy behind overcoming biases. There will be more, and there is more. Subscribe, like, do all those social media things that you're meant to do,
To be biased, to not to be biased. That's not the question.
It's the instruction.
Fantastic.